Today's episode has been brought to you by OfferingTree. I am sure that you didn't sign up to be a yoga teacher so you could spend more time writing emails, sending out Zoom links, or updating the code on your website. So if you would like to spend less time doing those things and more time teaching yoga and learning about yoga, check out OfferingTree. They have you covered with all of the tech side of things that you need for running a yoga business. And they have free workshops for yoga teachers as well. Make sure to get on their email list so that you don't miss out on the upcoming events that they have. And if you decide that their platform is a good fit for you, we have a coupon code for you. It's over at offeringtree.com/Shannon. I use OfferingTree. I love it. Go and check it out over at offeringtree.com/Shannon. Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. I use she, her pronouns, and this podcast is being recorded on Anishinaabeg, Odawa, and Mississauga land, also known as the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, Canada. Before we dive right in today, I really want to thank you for being here, first of all. I warned our regular listeners at the beginning of June that we were going to dig into some tough topics, and I'm just glad that you're here for one of those. This is a topic that has been personally a journey for me, and not an easy one, a very bumpy one, and one where I've gotten to the place where I really want to look at and acknowledge that the land I'm on and also the yoga practice that I use in my own day-to-day life and that I've chosen to share and talk about all of the time, that yoga was also taken. So the people and the cultures that cared for yoga for a really long time were not honored in the process of yoga being taken from them. And so I want to look at how I, as a white yoga teacher from the West, how can I take care of this practice? And I'm learning along the way. And like I said, it's messy and it's bumpy. You're going to hear some of that on the podcast today. And I think this learning journey is one that we're all doing in some capacity. And speaking of learning, and speaking of messing up in bumpy rides, I'm also a mom of 3. Those 3 individuals have been my best teachers in life. I'm also a yoga teacher, podcaster, and founder of Pelvic Health Professionals. And this podcast was created for you so that each and every week you are connected to information, inspiration, and ideas that are going to support you as you build your yoga business. This week's topic is something that I didn't understand enough about at first, and then I was really nervous when I finally did understand. And a little background story as well. A connected yoga teacher out in the community reached out to me at one point and said, I think it's really important that you start to talk about land acknowledgements in our Facebook group. And I did not understand enough at that point. My reaction was not one that was open to learning. And I talk about that in today's podcast episode. And I'm just so grateful that Jessica and Emmy are here to talk with us in today's episode, because they bring such a wealth of knowledge and experience to this topic. And I want to say that I continued to learn throughout the interview. You know, I like to kind of stick to one topic, and today's topic was land acknowledgement. And then I realize as we're talking in this interview and after the interview, and as I'm, just really thinking about things, that this is really just one tiny step, one tiny way that we can start to bring change. And you'll hear both Jessica and Emmy talk about that and talk about what we can do to continue on this journey of really acknowledging the land that we're on and the people who were here before us. Now, if you live in a part of the world where this is not a thing, I'm so curious now to know, like, which parts of the map was there not colonization? I don't know that. Now I want to look that up. But if you are not familiar with land acknowledgements, or this doesn't apply to where the land that you live on, I still think it's a really great conversation. So I'm excited to dive into this today, and still a little bit nervous, but more so excited that you get to meet Jessica and Emmy. So a little bit about them before we dive in. Jessica Barudin is a proud mother, Sundancer, yoga student, and trauma-informed yoga teacher. She's the co-founder of Cedar and Gold and collaborates with nations and organizations across Turtle Island. Make sure to check out Jessica's work. She's doing some amazing work out in the world. She's completing her doctoral studies, which is focused on developing culturally rooted, trauma-informed yoga for First Nations women and Two-Spirit folks. And I love that Jessica weaves in Indigenous embodied practices and teachings, as well as honors yoga's roots through sound, mudra, and a variety of things made accessible for all bodies. I'll make sure to link to Jessica's Instagram and website. On Instagram, Jessica's @JessicaBarudin. Our other guest today, Emmy Chahal, is a trauma-informed yoga teacher, body worker, energy healer, and workshop facilitator. Emmy works at the crossroads of business, social justice, and spirituality, and she has experience of more than 19 years of steady yoga and meditation practice and over 10 years of teaching. She integrates her educational background in cultural studies and gender and women's studies to offer tailored workshops for workplaces around wellness topics, cultural education for yoga teachers and practitioners on topics like cultural awareness, ancestral healing, and uncolonizing yoga, as well as intuitive healing sessions. Emmy also offers mentorship for yoga teachers and semi-private or family yoga classes. I'll also link to Emmy's website here in our show notes, so you can head on over to theconnectedyogateacher.com/277. And I'm excited because Emmy is now offering intuitive readings, soul coaching sessions, and all of that can be found on her website. She also has a book of poetry called Love Exposure, and it's available for purchase on her website, along with some audio and video sessions about cultural awareness for yoga. So make sure to check out both Emmy and Jessica's websites. And next week, Emmy's actually going to be back as a guest again on the podcast, because we're going to talk about a different topic that does really go along nicely with today's topic. And just a huge thank you to Emmy for also making this connection with Jessica. I feel like the two of them in this podcast episode is such a gift to our listeners. We cover a lot in today's episode, and at the same time, like I said, it's just this tiny step. So we get into things like why emotions like pain, guilt, fear, and anger are high for everyone when we talk about land acknowledgements. We also explore why it took so long for us to start thinking about this topic and how we can deepen our connection with the land that we live on. I really have been thinking about this conversation that we had as I've been spending time out in my garden. And we also talk about digging into your own cultures and your ancestral roots. And that's another thing that I've been doing. As I've been out in my garden, I've been listening to historical fiction books, ones that I choose pretty carefully, about the places that my ancestors are from. So Ireland, Scotland, England, and Germany. And I've been trying to look at what are some of the cultures that my people had before colonization. If you have a book suggestion that goes along with this, oh my gosh, I would love, love, love to hear it. Especially, I love books that talk a lot about nature. I talked on the podcast recently or a while ago, that I was reading Braiding Sweetgrass, thanks to so many of you recommending it. So if you have books like that that really talk about connections with nature, I would love to hear your recommendations. You can also put them in the show notes if you want to tell others about them. That's over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/277 for today's episode. And let's also just say you might experience some discomfort as you listen to today's episode. I definitely did in this conversation. And I think this is a normal thing to have come up as we sit with difficult topics. And I would really like us to do this together. And let's start here. Let's start today. You're here listening. Let's dive deeper into this topic and let's really see what's my role in this. How can I care for yoga? How can I care for the land that I'm on? And then the many cultures who had both of these things stolen from them. How can I really honor those cultures and those people? And then let's continue the conversation. Bring your questions and your thoughts. You can share those in our Facebook group, in the Connected Yoga Teacher Facebook group, or in the comments in the show notes. And definitely also consider how can I work further with Jessica and Emmy to learn more. All right, let's get right into today's conversation. And I'll be here at the end of it just to share my key takeaways and to wrap things up. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast, Emmy and Jessica. It's so great to have you both here today.
Lovely to be here. Thanks, Shannon.
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to be here with both of you.
I'm really excited and slightly nervous today to talk about land acknowledgements in regards to yoga classes and how to be more inclusive. But before we dive into why I'm nervous, why I'm feeling a bit of nervousness, and also our main topic, I was just wondering if both of you could tell our listeners what is the work that you do and who do you do it for? Jessica, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I'll just start off just by introducing myself. So, yo, Gela Kastochla, Nuga Amlat Sutsalas, Hetman Ligmi Jessica. Gaibtlin lacha Namgis tlu Kwayo tlu Chatwatmis, Guklin la Yalis, Iklikan Studakwo. It's nice to see your face here on the screen. And my name is Jessica Barudin. I am a Kwakwaka'wakw mother. I'm an Indigenous yoga teacher. I'm a doctoral student. And I live and work in my home community of Alert Bay, which is situated on our Namgis First Nation territory. Recently started to hold a elected seat on our council. So learning a lot more about our political landscape here. And quite busy with day-to-day work. I work with the First Nations Health Authority, and my role is traditional wellness specialist. So a lot of my work is really situated on working within and alongside First Nations communities, and particularly with my research and community work is very focused on working with and supporting and learning from First Nations women and girls and Two-Spirit folks. So that's a little bit about me and where I'm from and what I do. Kayla Kasla.
Thank you so much for that. Emmy, would you like to share what is the work that you do? Who do you do it for, and any other introduction?
Yeah, so my name is Emmy, and I'm here today speaking on the unceded ancestral, stolen traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in the place colonially known as Vancouver. And I work as a diversity and wellness consultant, mainly providing cultural awareness training for yoga teachers and different yoga teacher trainings. And I also work as a holistic healer. So I'm trained in a form of body work. So I do energy healing and body work with clients. And I'm in the process of setting up a farm and a nature retreat space in the long term. So yeah. And the work I do, it's mainly for, I would say, I have a wide variety of people that I work with, but it's mainly for anyone who's interested in intergenerational healing and how to be more inclusive. I work with people from all different backgrounds. I would say it's pretty broad in terms of who my work is for, but generally it's people who are interested in the deeper and complex questions of the systems of power that we live in and how can we create a more just and equitable world.
Thank you so much. And thank you both for being here. The reason why I'm excited and nervous is I'm excited because I know that our listeners are going to learn, and also I'm learning as I go here. And I had originally reached out because we had an email from one of our Connected Yoga Teacher listeners and member of our Facebook group reach out and say, I think it's super important that we do land acknowledgements as yoga teachers. And I remember thinking at the time, oh my goodness, I'm overwhelmed with looking at, and I just want to acknowledge that it's a really privileged thing for me to even say, and it's tough for me to say this now thinking back, but honestly, that was my first reaction was I'm looking at the ways that yoga has been culturally appropriated and sort of in this uncomfortable space. I felt like I wasn't receptive, basically, to listening to the importance of land acknowledgements. And it's been a while, and I've been talking about it on the podcast, how I'm trying to learn. And that is why I'm excited, because I feel like if I can use my mistake or my learning along the way of really kind of shutting down from learning and then thinking, oh no, we definitely, this is definitely important. Why couldn't I see that? And just to really be, acknowledge that here with both of you and for our listeners. I'm just really honored that both of you will share and take the time to talk about the importance. So both of you shared a land acknowledgement as your introduction, and I would love to hear, what is the importance of that? Jessica, do you want to share why that is important for us to look at, and who needs to be looking at sharing a land acknowledgement?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question and place to start with this dialogue. I definitely don't have a lot of definitive guidance in, telling people how they should open or close their yoga classes, and land acknowledgements are one way to start, but I think it's just it's just one way. And for me personally, I don't refer to it as a land acknowledgement per se. I think the difference there for me is that I'm living in my traditional homelands. I'm living on an island where, my generations of family members have lived for quite some time, and I have connections to not only, the land, but the waters and the natural elements here, the animals. So it's different for me as opposed to living in the city. I spent most of my life living in Vancouver and then also in Montreal and some time in New York. So very familiar with the urban lifestyle and how that experience of living on the land is much different from my current experience. And land acknowledgements have only, really recently popped up over the past few years, or since around 2015 with the Truth and Reconciliation, where it's becoming a bit more of a common practice, especially within institutions and organizations, as a gesture of acknowledging that, yes, we are on Indigenous lands, most of which have not been ceded. And as Emmy mentioned in her land acknowledgement, are stolen lands. So it's a good place to have a start into this dialogue. It is very charged. There is a lot of complex history, a lot of trauma of land dispossession and a lot of marginalization and ongoing harms that stem from this, colonial seizure of lands and Indigenous livelihood and connection to the land and spirituality. So, it's one element and a very small gesture of kind of acknowledging the bigger web of complexity of what land means. So I hope that's a starting place. So I'd invite Emmy to share a little bit more of her perspectives on this as well.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, it is charged, and it is almost painful, this topic in some ways. Just to place myself, my ancestors are from the north of India, where yoga is archaeologically found to have originated. And through, the trauma of colonialism in India, which was very different to the colonialism that happened on Turtle Island, but through the resource extraction colonialism that happened in India, my family was displaced and was part of the Windrush generation in England, where Indians were, quote unquote, invited to rebuild the British, rebuild England actually after World War II, and were promised economic opportunities as formerly colonized peoples. For a long time, I never understood, why did my family leave their homeland to go to the colonizer? But it was really because the colonizer had decimated India and they were promised economic opportunities and a better future. And of course, they got to England and nobody would hire them, and faced enormous racism, both my parents and my grandparents. So I come from this history of colonialism in India. And then my parents moved us to these Coast Salish lands when I was 4 years old. And I felt so betrayed by the school system. I'm, almost 30 years old and really had no concept of the history of genocide that I was living on. And, I started taking Indigenous literature courses at university. And I realized, the first time I had read an Indigenous author was when I was 20 years old. And I felt so ashamed and so much grief about that. And and land acknowledgements, I feel like it's the tip of the iceberg. It's like one tiny, tiny gesture that is an invitation for people to really look at their complicity in colonialism, and what history have we come out of here, and the ongoing harms that are happening, and what would it look like to bridge some of these conversations about land back, and what would quote unquote allyship look like. To me, a land acknowledgement is like the very tiniest first effort at opening up a bigger conversation. But I'm really tired of how land acknowledgements have become lip service, where it's like, well, what are you doing about that fact that you live on stolen territory? That's the question that I would like listeners to contemplate.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much to you both. I feel like there was so much that I took in there, and I feel like I could listen to that again and take in a lot more. A couple of things that you both said that this is one small gesture and there's so much more that we can do to learn. And Emmy, I echo what you said about living here. I mean, I have lived in Canada or lived on Turtle Island, and now I'm hesitating. Don't hesitate to share with me what would be the most the way to honor that when I'm talking about locations as I do this. But I grew up not knowing, not learning anything about residential schools, or even, as you're saying, the tip of the iceberg, this land acknowledgement that was never in my elementary or high school education, not even in my college education. And I saw it start to come in with my children, and obviously a lot more has come forward. And Jessica, I'm so glad that you said that this has just been, in the last 5 or so years, like 2015, that's not long enough at all, really, for us to start to become aware of this. So one thing that I want to share with our listeners is, if you're listening to this and if you're like me in how I was feeling, like, I'll try and articulate how that felt. Just, I felt like there was a lot coming at me, learning about how yoga was definitely colonized, and then learning that the land that we're on is also colonized. And Emmy, I feel like you spoke to this when you said it's exhausting to kind of be fighting this. I don't know if there's anything either of you want to say in terms of, when you feel that coming up, when you feel, if our listeners are feeling like I did, like this, I just want to say it feels like putting up the defense mode and not listening, not even understanding or hearing. So what would you, I'm hesitating again, because I feel like it's not on either of you to spend the energy and the time to educate someone who's feeling like I am. And yet I want to ask the question, I guess. And I'm sorry, it's very jumbled. Do either of you have thoughts on why people are feeling this defense coming up, and what maybe we could do instead?
Yeah, I can start if that's okay. Well, first of all, I just want to say that there's this conversation brings up emotions for us, for everybody, for anybody in any social location is going to have emotions around this conversation. And I don't think there's a single training I've done where people haven't cried. And that is a reflection of the trauma collectively that we all hold, whether we are ancestrally connected to the oppressor or those that have experienced oppression. It's heavy. And, I think the defensiveness is what I experienced for up until George Floyd's murder. Whenever I would bring up the topic of being, Indian and yoga and all the cultural appropriation, up until George Floyd's murder, nobody wanted to talk about it. I would bring it up, anytime I met a yoga teacher almost. And maybe I didn't always do it super gently. Sometimes maybe I was a bit aggressive. But, that was, again, my anger coming up, which is, I think, valid. And people would say to me, don't talk about it. Just don't talk about it. I'm uncomfortable. Like you're threatening my very worldview. You're threatening my source of livelihood. You're threatening everything I thought I knew about the world. I want to shut down and pretend like you didn't say that. And I'm not going to honor what you said. And I don't think it's spiritual. There are so many ways people, would respond. And I guess I'm really touched, and I'm really grief stricken that it took a murder on television to change people's minds and wake them up to the reality of what I've been living with for all my life as a person of color, the kinds of microaggressions and racism that happen every day to Black people, the ongoing colonialism and racism towards Indigenous people. All of us BIPOC people have lived with so much emotion for our whole lives. And then suddenly, I guess, it all caught up in this one global moment. And then it was kind of like this wave of overwhelm. And I can empathize with how you feel. And I can empathize with the defensiveness and the wall that comes up. And I think it's really interesting to ask, why did it take that experience of someone's murder to wake us up? That is how pervasive these systems of power are. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I just want to acknowledge that the emotions are always part of this conversation. And I think it's really important to be gentle with yourself and forgiving and to sit with the complexity and the pain and the guilt and all of that. There's a really good podcast episode with Robin DeAngelo and Resma Menakem on the On Being podcast with Krista Tippett. And I always recommend that to my clients, as a starting place to talk about some of those emotions. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. We'll make sure to link to that podcast. Jessica, what are your thoughts?
I just wanted to acknowledge that I really appreciate you taking the time to name what you're feeling and what you're experiencing, and also talk it through, even though maybe there's some hesitancy there of not wanting to say something wrong, of not wanting to offend, or whatever it may be. So I think that's really important, and it is a good way of teaching and learning, especially for people who are listening to your podcast and also in the same boat of learning. So just appreciating that vulnerability that coming to this discussion to Emmy and I to talk about land acknowledgements, which may seem very simple, but as we can tell, it is very complex. It's very charged, and I think that's where yoga is such a beautiful practice. It's such a beautiful teacher to help us to sit with this and to work through it and to breathe through it and to have that guidance. And also the land is the best teacher for this as well. It's something that we as all humans get to benefit and enjoy living on this land, whether you want to call it Turtle Island or the place name of where you're situated on the traditional territories, or the colonial name, whatever it may be. But just really starting to unpack and appreciate a lived experience of being on the land and a part of the land. I think that's where the next step goes with, when we acknowledge the land. Is it just a token gesture, or is it something that we're deepening our relationships with where we are and what time in history, not speaking on a linear timeline, but how can we really reconnect and deepen our relationships and improve ourselves as human beings, as spiritual beings, to really be in right relation, not just with each other, but with all of our non-human relatives as well. So I think that's what I would just suggest as something to keep on working towards. And there's so much that you just do a simple search online and you can find a lot of great documents, guiding documents that give some guidance of how to go about even considering land acknowledgements, and the extras that will take you beyond just, what do you say in a land acknowledgement and what can you do beyond a land acknowledgement. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, this is so good. I love how you said that these tools are here for us, yoga, but also connecting with nature. I feel like these are the two things that do sustain me, and I'm really excited that they come into today's conversation of how we can even look at this topic and start to dig deeper and use those both. So when our connected yoga teachers are starting a yoga class, whether it's in person or online, or they're starting a workshop or a yoga teacher training, how can they, this is something that I struggled with, so I'm happy to use this as an example. I wanted to start to do a land acknowledgement on the podcast, but at the same time, I didn't want to mispronounce names. I didn't want to just do this as, oh, this is this routine thing that everyone must do now. I wanted it to have more meaning than just, here's the land, I'm going to mispronounce the words, and there, check, it's done. And both of you have said that how important that is. I mean, I can share what I say, and then maybe you can share thoughts on how we can strengthen this practice. So on the podcast, I talk about how I live on Odawa, Mississauga, and Anishinaabe land, and all of my ancestors came as immigrants to Canada, and I'm learning more about what that means. And then I actually am learning more about what that means on my own time, and I talk about it sometimes on the podcast. I'm trying to read more books. I'm trying to look into different trainings that cover this. And in Canada, we're really lucky because we have that a lot. We have a lot right now, I feel like, that we can learn from, especially online as well. So when our yoga teachers want to introduce that, Emmy, I don't know if you want to go first on how we can start to practice this when it might feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. So first off, I want to say, I don't know if there's a right or a wrong way to do this. I feel like it has to be, for me, it has to be heartfelt, and it has to be honest, and it has to point towards deeper action. And so I can just share what I talk about in some of my workshops in terms of a land and a lineage acknowledgement. A lineage acknowledgement is referring to the fact that yoga comes from India, and that that's where its roots are. And as an Indian person, I feel a lot more safe in a room when someone is able to acknowledge the roots and cite the sources, instead of, making it seem like all of this ancient knowledge is from them personally and that they're profiting from it. So, it's a few things come to mind in terms of how I do it. And like I said, I don't think it's the right way or the wrong way. I don't really know. So what I do is I acknowledge that it's stolen. I talk about what that means, and in terms of the land that I'm on and the history of colonialism, and what how important decolonization is to the work that I'm doing. And then I really try to express my gratitude to the land, and I really try to locate myself as an uninvited guest here, someone who was also displaced by colonialism and that seeks to work toward intergenerational healing and standing in solidarity with BIPOC people and my Indigenous friends. And there's a lot more learning I need to do there too, that I'm in an ongoing way, trying to foster more awareness and more relationships that are meaningful, and more ways of giving back, and how can I support the land back movement and all of this. So yeah, I like to express gratitude and go a bit deeper than just like one sentence, and talk about my own ancestry as well. I like to locate myself and just discuss how colonialism is relevant to that, whatever I'm doing that day, and how I'm working towards a better future. I think it's definitely easy to be hard on myself too, and be like, I'm not doing enough, or I should be doing more. But I think every little step along the journey counts. And just, when people tell me they're nervous or they're scared or hesitant to say the wrong thing, I always take that as like, that's a good sign. That means that you care, and just having the courage to make mistakes and try again. I think that's really important. Yeah.
Hey, Connected Yoga teachers, I am popping in here for a moment because I wanted to share a bit of a conversation that I recently had with Sarah Villamil, a yoga teacher who's from Calgary, Alberta, who is using the OfferingTree platform. Yes, I talk about OfferingTree lots because I use the software. I really like it. I like the company, and they sponsor the podcast. But I thought, how great would it be if you could hear from another yoga teacher who uses OfferingTree?
I started using OfferingTree about a year and a half ago, when I realized that I definitely needed to be offering a more accessible online offering, and making the offerings that I had predominantly online in a way that would be really user-friendly, seamless, and accessible for my clients.
How did you find out about OfferingTree?
I found out about OfferingTree right at the exact right moment. I had been trying some trials with other platforms and not really getting anywhere. And I hadn't yet given my credit card information to try one. I was in the free trial stages for so many different platforms. I was actually listening to your podcast, Shannon, and you had mentioned OfferingTree, and I thought, okay, I'll try this. So I was just lying in bed with my son, who's a difficult sleeper. He has trouble getting to sleep to this day. And so I was lying in bed with him and he was almost asleep. And I looked up OfferingTree online and I tried the free trial that was available at that time. And in like half an hour, I basically had the framework for my website, and everything that I had hoped to include in my website was there, easy enough to be done almost entirely on my phone. So I thought, okay, this is definitely the one that I need to try. This is absolutely perfect.
That's amazing that you could do it from your phone. So then I know that your website, it's built using their platform. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it looks amazing. Is there anything that you would say to connected yoga teachers who are thinking, okay, I want my website to be on OfferingTree, but I also want it to look like me. I want to customize it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would say photos are really a big part of it. And if you can't afford to get your own photos done, you can look on some of the free stock photos, but maybe choose photos that are unique to you. So maybe you don't want them all to be of yoga pictures. Maybe like on mine, you might notice that I use a lot of images of flowers because I love flowers. I mean, who doesn't love flowers? I have used those in cases where I didn't have the proper image to put in there. If you can afford to get professional photos, they make a huge difference. If you can do photos yourself on your iPhone and just really perfect them using, the best natural light that you can find and edit them, that's also an option. So I think photos are a big part of it. Writing in a way that suits your voice. So if you find it hard to write, a trick is to speak into your audio and record your voice, and then just basically transcribe from there. Make it sound like you. So those are a couple of tips that I would say to try to make it yourself. Also to make it suit yourself and your own style. And then colors. So OfferingTree, the designing on the platform is so easy, and you can choose your own color palette quite easily. So I would say choose colors that suit the pictures that you're using or colors that really resonate with you. And you can change them as you go, which is also really nice because, of course, we change what we like over time. So I love how easy it is to change the colors.
Oh my goodness. These are great tips for anyone building a website. Really love these. Thank you so much, Sarah, for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. If you are thinking about using OfferingTree, make sure to check out Sarah's website. It is so great. It's sarahvillamil.com. So Sarah with no H, S-A-R-A. Villamil is VILLAMIL.com. And if you're busy and on the go, we will put Sarah's website in the show notes for today's episode. And if you do decide to sign up for OfferingTree, we have a discount code for you. Make sure to head on over to offeringtree.com/Shannon to get that. And we'll also put that in the show notes for you because I know you're probably busy. If you're anything like me while you listen to podcasts, you might be doing your laundry or cleaning or driving or running or getting that dog walk today. I get it. So now let's get back into the conversation with Jessica and Emmy. Jessica, what would you add? I know you had said that it's different for you because, and I'm not even sure if I can repeat it, but you said that your people have always lived on that land and it wasn't. Am I getting that right? That it wasn't stolen land?
Well, not exactly. There's a lot of complexities to where I live in particular, like my geographic location. So I live in Alert Bay, which is the northern part of Vancouver Island. And so my family, my grandmother has lived here. She was raised by my great-grandmother or great-great-grandmother here. But they were forcibly relocated to Alert Bay. So originally my grandmother and her mother and grandmother came from even a more remote village in Kingham Inlet. And that's very common for a lot of Kwakwaka'wakw folks who live in Alert Bay. A lot of them have been, through their family lines, relocated because their lands were dispossessed, and also they were forced to go to the residential school that was here, St. Michael's Indian Residential School. And so Alert Bay is my home community, but for a lot of people, it's ground zero. So there was, the Indian residential school that was here. There was an Indian agent stationed here. There was the Anglican church, and there was a lot of, other industry that was booming here, and kind of modernization. This was sort of like the city almost to a lot of people who lived in their traditional villages that were very different, and a lot of them just don't live there anymore because of that colonial pressure and dispossession of lands and forcible removal to attend residential school, and just the loss of rights. Like, there's so much historical stuff in there that I could talk about further, but I think what I meant is that just being in my home community, even that in itself, I have to acknowledge that there's a lot of history here that I'm only really starting to understand and scratch the surface. And, I also, in the same Canadian education system, didn't learn about residential schools. I remember it being just like sort of a paragraph in one of my social studies books, and I didn't, my family didn't talk about it, even though several of my aunts and uncles attended St. Michael's Indian Residential School. My mother took care of a lot of her siblings. My mother she was the oldest daughter of a family of 12. And so that wasn't something that we talked about in our day-to-day. And it wasn't until I got to my first year in college where I took a First Nation studies class and started to understand a lot of these policies, a lot of the politics, and, the harm that was done specifically to First Nations people in, what's currently known as British Columbia. But I think that just for me personally, as a First Nations woman, as a Kwakwaka'wakw woman, living on Namgis territory, it's really a reconnection and realignment to the lands, the waters, and the airs here, and just kind of finding ways to connect, because I know that my ancestors, whether they were Namgis or whether they were Muskmaq or Kwakwaka'wakw or, coming from other nations, our connections run very deep up and down the coast through intermarriage and over time. So it's recognizing the plurality of these different identities and many ancestors, and really respecting how they had such high intelligence of living on the land and being in harmony and harvesting food and being very connected to everything around them. Like, we're very lucky in our modern lives. We don't have to worry about those things. So for me, it's just finding new ways and sort of resituating what I want for myself and for my daughters and for my future grandbabies, and being more connected. So that's what I mean. It doesn't feel the same as crafting a well-worded land acknowledgement that I can say in a class or put in my email signature. It goes a lot deeper intergenerationally. And I think the only thing that I would add is that, on top of that connection to the land itself and the territory, is really situating yourself with the communities that have been impacted, but who are still living and still thriving and resilient. And, there's generations of people who are still fighting to maintain that spiritual connection to land, the physical connection, and living in balance in that way. So just reminding folks out there that there's nations of people who are working hard at strengthening and having some powerful tools of reclamation for our youth and future generations. So just to situate that, we're living beings on this land who have been impacted and continue to be marginalized in many ways. And I know I didn't touch on, what Emmy shared, but that's something that I'm constantly reflecting on as really situating the roots of yoga and finding ways of appropriately situating myself in the practice as, a so-called yoga teacher. I'm a constant student and always learning, and it's really about building relationships and understanding more and just constantly learning and correcting if I make a mistake or if I misspeak or if I'm maybe not being as, acknowledging the roots of yoga and how that colonial history has also shares a lot of parallels to my nation here and other nations across Turtle Island. So, yeah.
I'm really just appreciating how you both have highlighted how you're also learning, and this wasn't part of your education and we're still learning even though it's been your lived experience. And also, all of a sudden, as you were saying this, Jessica, and thank you for sharing your story of sort of like a really beautiful way to share the history in the time that we have, because I think you could tell us about the land for a long time. It made me all of a sudden realize, how would you do a quick one sentence land acknowledgement and contain that? So I'm wondering, does it evolve? Like mine on the podcast has evolved at different times. I find a lot of comfort in thinking that my relatives came here as immigrants, or I find a lot of, I don't know why I grasp onto that so much, thinking right now, what it helps me with is to remember that my ancestors were not born here, or to acknowledge that. And I'm guessing, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, like how do we as yoga teachers start that practice and then allow it to evolve? Or do we ever get to a point where we just can't even do it justice as a land acknowledgement? Like I am a little bit concerned that our connected yoga teachers might be saying, oh, I just wanted like the one sentence that I would say to acknowledge the lineage and then to acknowledge the land. If either of you would like to share, I'm sorry, I'm thinking out loud at the same time as I'm asking you jumbled questions.
No, it's all valid. And, I hear that a lot in terms of, I just want the answers of how I can decolonize yoga, or I just want one sentence that I can say. And I'm like, it's not that simple. It really isn't. And we can't avoid the harder work of really digging into, like I said, our complicity and complacency with colonialism. Like we are all benefiting from genocide. That's the truth. And as settlers here, we are benefiting from colonialism, and that's deep work, And I don't think, sometimes I almost feel like it's a balance between learning and gaining information and developing relationships and then taking action. Like I don't think people should take impulsive, not thought out actions like, just give me a script and I'll say it, and then nothing ever changes in their life, or they don't contemplate how the trauma of colonialism is still affecting so many Indigenous people on Turtle Island and worldwide. Like we are coming out of a history that is gruesome and violent and about domination. And the only way, in my opinion, that we're not going to repeat that is if we're willing to move through the emotions of it and decide to act differently once we know more. When we know better, we do better. So I would say it's good if you feel like you are like, this isn't just one sentence. It isn't. And honestly, I try to, my land acknowledgement, my lineage acknowledgement changes every day that I every time I work and I'm presenting, it's going to sound different because my journey is always evolving. My relationship to this earth is always evolving. My relationship to my ancestors is always evolving. So just to be open and sharing that transparently and honestly, and bringing the truth that we live in a system that has oppressed and marginalized certain people, just bringing light to that is a huge thing, in my opinion. However you do it, it's important that you do it, and that you're committed to really, working through the deeper meaning of it. And then the other thing I would say is that for me, the number one thing that I'd like to see is, not the number one, but one of the huge things I'd like to see is folks of European descent remembering their ancestors and going back to their earth-based embodiment and spiritual practices. And this is something that I really believe, as someone who comes from where yoga originated, I don't think there would be as much stealing and cultural appropriation and claiming my culture as yours, or consuming my culture and buying my culture. I don't think that would be happening if people felt as so deeply rooted in their own being. If people knew that their ancestors, you might have to go way back, you might have to go thousands of years back, but everyone's ancestors, I believe, had an embodiment, earth-based spiritual practice, which is what yoga is to me. And by knowing your own ancestors and learning about them, and grappling with your part in colonialism and working through that trauma, because like I said, the trauma exists for the oppressor and those that experience oppression. By working through that, you have deeper roots, and you're not, I think you're less at risk to steal other people's cultures and their spiritual practices without really honoring them or having a deep personal relationship with other cultures. There are really positive ways to engage cross-culturally, but sadly, the yoga industry has not done a good job of that so far.
Thank you so much, Emmy. I really appreciate how you say dig into your roots. I've heard this from you before and on a different podcast, and I really started to think about this and look at, okay, what did my ancestors make as food? What were some of their practices? So thank you. It's a huge part of it. Jessica, do you have anything to add or share with us on this?
No, I just appreciate listening.
I also want to know, and Jessica, maybe you can share your thoughts on this. How has yoga helped Indigenous communities in what you have seen?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's something that I continue to reflect upon in my own practice and in the work that I'm doing in my community here and with my doctoral research, because it's endless. Yoga has been such an enriching practice and way of being in my life. It's really given me a guidance, a compass to come back to my own spirituality, to my own culture. I love the practice of yoga and just learning about yoga and its roots and experiencing the different ways that we can heal through our breath, through movement, through meditation, and through living the philosophies. And it's brought me full circle to my own culture, because we have our systems of healing that aren't documented like the yogic tradition has been. Our people have always used the oral tradition since time immemorial, and we didn't have a written system, not because we weren't sophisticated enough to develop one, but that wasn't part of our worldview. It wasn't part of our paradigm. And we have a lot of beautiful practices of healing and land-based healing and spirituality in particular, and very complex ceremonies and songs. And that's what a lot of my research is looking to better understand through learning from our knowledge keepers, from our fluent speakers who speak Kwakwaka'wakw our language comes from the land, and yoga is a land-based practice. It's a spiritual practice, and the same way that our cultures are all embedded with these really rich teachings. So I think that's where it provides a bridge. In my perspective, that's what I felt to deepening your own spiritual development and growth, and in the modern sense, and I don't know, I haven't been formally trained, by traditional Indian teachers. I haven't most of my yoga experience has been based on yoga in the West, and how, yoga in Vancouver in particular and other cities, and how that's shifted. So, that real authentic connection to yogic practices has just been through self-exploration and reconnecting to my own cultural practices, like I had mentioned. So, it's hard to say exactly, and I think there's so much room for growth and exploration there. But that's the work that we're doing, is looking at how is our system of healing, like in this, what I'm speaking of, Kwakwaka'wakw, or other First Nations wellness systems. How do we have these tools that are embedded in our own culture, that are embedded in our language, that we can reclaim and that we can revitalize? And then how can we actually come together as a community and practice yoga and understand a bit more about how the breath unites, our mind and our body and our spirit, and how movement helps us to move, energy and sometimes deeply stored emotions and traumas, and helps us to release that from our bodies. And how can we be in right relation and have, a means of being reciprocal in connecting with Indian people, with connecting with other people of color, or other people who are marginalized in our, by the dominant society. So it's a constant way of coming back to self and to community and to the land. And for me, it's also, yoga is providing this sort of beautiful framework of bringing people together in my community to connect with each other and to learn our language. So, there's a lot more to say about that piece, but, I'd love to hear what Emmy has to say about that as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Jessica. And, it's been such an honor and such a delight getting to know you a little bit more over the last year. And last year I was part of, I was a guest speaker at Jessica's amazing doctoral research and her project with Yoga Outreach, the First Nation Women's Yoga Initiative. It was such an amazing healing experience for me to feel a sense of solidarity and connection. And, everything you shared kind of reminds me of the beauty of cross-cultural learning. And something that Jessica shared with me earlier on was, it's not about blending or merging traditions or systems. It's about connecting and learning about each unique perspective and finding common ground. And I don't know if I quoted you right, Jessica, but you said something really beautiful about that. And it stuck with me because, yeah, I think that is a really gorgeous gift that my ancestors gave to the world, is a framework to learn from and to benefit from. And it's not like I don't want people to be connected to yoga. I just want them to do it in a respectful and responsible and honoring way, which Jessica is totally an amazing example of. So, yeah, I think yoga to me, especially, when you look at the yamas, the niyamas, and the 8 limbs of yoga and the philosophies of yoga, really point to being a good human, like being an ethical human, being a connected human, and feeling the oneness that transcends our differences. And, I think I'd love to see a future where people's ancestral gifts are really treasured and honored and learned from, and people can really share those gifts without commodification of other people profiting irresponsibly, or Lululemons popping up everywhere, or Indian yoga teachers not being hired. Like, this is all the stuff that has existed in the past, in Vancouver especially, is like just deep racism in the yoga community. And it's very recent that that has come to light. But for myself as an Indian yoga teacher and my colleagues who are Indian, we've been feeling totally left out of so much. And that's been a huge healing journey for me, is to really come to forgive the systems that I live in and actually have the courage to build meaningful relationships with people of all backgrounds, even if in the past some of those people have maybe harmed me or harmed my people. The fact that we can now sit and talk about deconstructing colonial framework and moving away from really oppressive systems of power and thinking about doing things differently, the fact that we can talk about that, I know my ancestors would be proud, because to me, yoga is about collective liberation. It's not just exercise. It's about feeling your connectedness to all beings.
Thank you both so much. I feel like I asked you for the impossible today, where I was like, can you just tell us the quick thing that we do to fix all of this? And you both gave so many things for us to consider now. I'm just very grateful for the work that you're both doing in the world. And I'd love for our connected yoga teachers to take this today and think, all right, this is important. How can I learn how to really respect the lineage of yoga and the land that I live on and the people who were here first, really caring for the land? So do you want to tell us, Jessica, how can we connect with you further and follow the work that you're doing and support the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you, Shannon, and thanks for having me here. It's been a really rich conversation, and just to kind of listen and talk through some things and share just a few of my perspectives. Right now, I think the best way, if anyone would like to connect with me, email is good, or on Instagram. We have a Facebook page. Emmy mentioned the initiative, so that's part of my doctoral research, and I have a partnership with the Yoga Outreach Society, where we've co-created with several community members and knowledge keepers and other experts to develop an 80-hour trauma-informed and culturally rooted yoga program that's currently called the First Nations Women's Yoga Initiative. So it's 80 hours, it's all virtual, and we've had one cohort last year of 20 women, and it's open to women and Two-Spirit folks. And this year we're running our second cohort, so I'm really excited about that. So that will run from the winter, so from February until end of May. And we have our bases pretty well covered for the cohort. Really excited. We've got some amazing elders, fluent speakers, guests coming in, as well as my co-lead, Nicole, Marcia, and I are leading the curriculum. And it's really exciting. So, and then that's just layered in with some of my research that I've already done from our first cohort, some interviews just to connect with the participants, and just how impactful that was. That first session with Emmy really struck a lot of our participants and how they approach the practice of yoga. So I guess that was just the other thing I wanted to add on, just in closing, is just how beautiful it is to build these cross-cultural relationships, and to always include BIPOC people, especially Indian people, in your work, and Indigenous people, and offer whatever programs that you're having in connection with the communities where you're situated. So we have our First Nations Women's Yoga Initiative, which is on. We have a Facebook page that's open for updates, and then just something that I'm kind of doing on the side of my desk, but it's on Instagram, called Indigenous Yoga Movement, and we'll post a bit more about the initiative there. And it's just something to uplift and try, amplify in the echo chamber that is social media, but, to spotlight Indigenous yoga teachers in particular. So there's a lot of amazing people out there doing similar work or doing their own grassroots work where they're teaching yoga in communities. And those are the people that we're really excited about connecting with and working with, and other people who might be in other positions to support or to promote or donate or help to connect to other partnerships. There's a need for this to be sustainable, and there's a need for this to be ongoing, to create safe spaces for Indigenous folks and other people of color to come together and to have spaces to heal and to also reclaim our own cultures and languages. So, other ways to connect and support would just be looking into your own local communities where there's, nations, maybe there's a language fund or maybe there's a youth fund. If you have the means to donate or, contribute your time or support in other ways, those are just some recommendations that come to mind. But yeah, I'll leave my email with you and you can share as you see fit. Gaila Kasla.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'll make sure that we link to the Instagram and also the offering as well. Thank you. Emmy, how can our listeners connect with you?
Yeah, so the best place to stay in touch with me would be my website. So it's just Emmy, Emmy Chahal, CHAHAL.com. And then also on Instagram, just my first and last names as well. And I'm totally happy to collaborate on, totally happy to collaborate with anybody around cultural awareness training and yoga. And so that's probably the best way to contact me.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmy and Jessica. Oh my goodness. I had a lot of key takeaways from this conversation that we had. And most of all, I'm just feeling grateful that you shared so much here with all of us in today's podcast episode, and that you're doing so much out in the world as well. And I have been really looking at how can I deepen my connection with the land? How can I be really present when I'm outside and working in my garden or looking at the sunset? And wow, there are so many moments where I get really excited, when I see the sunset or I see a bug or a bird that's new to me, or I witness something out in nature. So I guess if I could say, let's all do one thing or take one piece of homework for today, and you can't think of one, maybe you already thought of one as you listen to today's episode. But if you can't think of one, the next time you're out in nature, really notice what's around you. I think the more connected we are with nature, the more grounded we are as humans, and also the more connected we are to the earth and how we can care for the earth, including all of the creatures that are on the earth as well. So that is my biggest key takeaway. And as I said earlier, if you have a book where you're like, this is a great book, Shannon, to read about anything that you think is related to today's topic, decolonization, or, some of the history of colonization that has to do with land and yoga is what I'm really interested in, or just how to connect more with the land, or how to connect more with our ancestors and our roots. I would be so curious to hear what you're doing, what your thoughts are after today's episode. Make sure to reach out and let us know. Alrighty, connected yoga teachers, as I get ready to sign off here, I did want to tell you about something over in Pelvic Health Professionals, which is a place where we hire guest experts to talk about all kinds of pelvic health topics. This is really useful if you're working with individuals who have a pelvis. That's basically what we cover, is everything to do with the pelvis. A lot of people will think, pelvic health, that is just for women who are having babies. Nope, it's for every human with a pelvis and a pelvic floor. But I wanted to tell you about some amazing guest speakers and topics that we have coming up. Now, all of our previous guest speakers and topics you can see if you head on over to pelvichealthprofessionals.com and you look at our guest expert page, because last month we had a really fascinating call where we talked about bowel health with Michelle Lyons. And coming up in July, we're going to be talking about the energetics of the pelvis with Leslie Howard. I'm so excited that Leslie is coming back as a guest expert in Pelvic Health Professionals. If you want to join us, you can. And then in August, we're going to be talking about desire and libido with Dr. Rose Schlaff. And in September, Jill is coming to talk with us about endometriosis and pelvic health. We have some other guest speakers that we're just confirming for the end of this year as well. Tons of information in there that really relates to everybody that you are teaching yoga to. So if you're wanting to check this out, head on over to pelvichealthprofessionals.com. And if you have questions about the membership, reach out and ask me. I am happy to answer those at any time. You can email us info@pelvichealthprofessionals.com. Thank you so much to our entire team over here helping to bring this episode to you. Suzanne, Crunch, and Sinead, you're all such amazing people doing amazing work out in the world. And I am just grateful each and every week when we can bring a podcast episode together because of your work. Thank you also, dear listener, for being here. It means a lot that you've hung out here all the way to the end of today's episode and that you've hung out while we learn together, maybe through some moments of discomfort. And let's keep going with this. Let's keep learning. And in the meantime, I would love to know, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?